So, nowcasting well-being in societies. Well, this is an idea that basically goes back to FuturICT, and some of you may still remember it. So, at that time we proposed to build a planetary nervous system, basically to measure what's going on in the world and create awareness in real time. I don't want to mention the other parts because they're not so important for this talk over here. But so big data is certainly located around here, and in the meantime, of course, there's a new field of science which is called data science. So this goes beyond just big data in the way Chris Anderson imagined it, where basically algorithms by themselves would reveal everything. I don't think this is actually the case. Well, we're certainly basking in big data. In a minute, we are producing 700,000 Google queries and 500,000 Facebook posts, and we move around, we go shopping, all of that creates data. And the idea originally was that this would allow us to see what is wrong, also in society, and thereby basically to fix the problem. It turns out it's actually not so simple, even though to some extent we can say data is the new oil. We haven't always already learned to refine that raw oil into fuel that is useful. So basically, if data is the new oil, we have to learn to refine it. And what is the problem? For example, there's spurious correlations, and here's just one example. So number of serial killers as a function of chocolate consumption. If there was a real causal relationship, it would be very dangerous to live in Switzerland, but so far it was pretty okay. Now, another subject that of course relates well to Lippery, which is heat and forest fires. If you would correlate that with the number of ice cream eating children or granita eating professors, that would be a very strong correlation. But if you would put them to jail, that wouldn't change the number of forest fires, because there is an independent third causal factor, which is heat, right? If you think, oh, these stupid mistakes couldn't happen to us or to Google or whomever, unfortunately you're wrong, because they did actually happen. So in the beginning, in the early days of 23andMe, it turned out that the US Health Authority had to take off this product from the market because it turned out that the conclusions were not reliable. So if you asked another company to come up with an evaluation of your genes and make predictions about your health and your likely diseases and cause of death, other companies would come to different conclusions. So there is this problem of sensitivity, not only to the algorithms that you use, but also to the data set. So if you add a few data points or subtract them, that could change the results, and even changing the hardware would sometimes change the result. That is pretty shocking, I should say. Google came up with this flu trend, as you know. It was shown around as the success story among a few other success stories in the early days of big data. In the meantime, actually, it's being seen as a failure. It didn't work well anymore. It's taken off actually. So there's not any more a Google flu service. So just doing brute force big data analytics doesn't do the job in many cases. So basically, scientists are still needed in order to understand what is going on really in the data. So if you want to take out really useful information, you need to know how to look at the data, how to process them. For example, if you look at the spread of diseases, at the spatial temporal patterns of who gets ill where on Earth, first, then basically you get a very random picture, and that's why you have over here this wide spread of data. So it's not very useful. And the reason for this is that people are using the plane to travel, and that's why we don't anymore have a diffusion of diseases as we had it at the times of the Black Death. But instead, you would get such a pattern as those simulations by Dirk show you. So it starts similar, but then it gets very different and spreads much faster and less predictable, it seems. But if you take into account the trouble patterns, that means the volumes of passengers going from airport A to airport B around the world, then you can define a new effective distance, and cities such as Frankfurt and New York cities would be located close by because there's a large volume of passengers. Now if you do this, then suddenly the spreading pattern again becomes a diffusive pattern, a circular spreading from the inside, the source of the disease, the origin, to the outside, and you can basically predict what would be the next cities where the flu would be bad. And you can prepare for this in a proactive way and send doctors and medicine and so on. So now you can see as a pretty linear dependency, and that means now we're basically seeing in the data what's going on. We understand why this is going on. So we're basically transforming this spreading pattern into this spreading pattern, and this is much more useful. It's also been used in order to assess the risk of import of Ebola. Dirk is doing a lot of really fascinating work on this. We have published a paper together in Science, as you may know. Now what we want to do is to craft new instruments to explore the world, and in particular to create compasses for decision makers. And I was always particularly interested in making things visible that you couldn't see with your eyes or basically feel with your other senses, because that has made big progress in science. When people came up with microscopes and telescopes, suddenly they could see things that couldn't be seen beforehand. And so what is the stuff that could be made visible in society that we can't see today, but is really important? Social capital, for example, such as reputation, trust, solidarity, compliance. Those are the things that we should see, and then we would really notice the value of it, and we would start protecting it much more. When we started to pay attention to the value of forests and of ecosystems, we also started to protect them much more. So that's the idea. And we were starting to work on measuring social well-being. This is still preliminary, so we're still working on this, and whoever wants to join in to push it really towards success, I think this can be a big and important piece of work. What we're doing here is basically measuring what is usually measured with the World Values Survey every few years with a substantial amount of money through Google Trends data, which is available every time at every place. So we could get a disaggregated picture, we could get a much more timely picture, we could see changes, right? So in principle the idea is to see how did the financial crisis change trust, how did the financial crisis change happiness or fairness, these kind of things, say in Italy or in Germany or how does unemployment change happiness, trust, and these kind of things, right? So we should be able to see that in the Google Trends data and produce maps, but how to basically turn Google Trends data into the kind of quantities that we'd like to measure. And here's a proposal. You're not just taking Google Trends as you get it and basically look for trust and then you see a peak or it breaks down or something. Of course, that doesn't work very well. What works much better is to use so-called semantic differentials or polarity profiles. That's a method that has been introduced by psychologists many years back, actually decades back, so it's an established method, and here you have the polarities, I mean the opposite pairs of words like high and low and weak and strong and rough and smooth and active and passive and so on and so on. And for every single word or whatever you're interested in, you would ask people, is it more high or is it more low, is it more weak or more strong? And then you get this profile. Here, by the way, you see two lines, one for the color red and one for the word love, and you can see there's quite a little bit of similarity, and that's actually why color red is often used as a representative for love. So hearts are shown in red, right? So there is this correlation over here. Okay, so we have looked into different ways to calculate values as a function of the Google Trend data of the positive and negative words that I mentioned before. Now, the idea is that you would have over here a certain quantity that has been measured by the World Value Survey, and you want to reproduce it with the Google Trends data, and you would have to find weights for certain keywords in Google Trends that would basically map this function. And so there are different approaches that we have tested, and we'll see which ones work well and which ones don't work so well. The idea is, of course, to have not too many terms in the sum, right? So that you have basically 3 or a maximum of 5 terms that characterize what we want to have characterized. So let's look into the World Value Survey 2006 and happiness, right? So happiness is measured in the World Value Survey, and then we're looking into the Google Trend pairs, and it turns out these are the most characteristic ones. They basically describe the dependencies throughout the world best. Wealth, poverty. Makes a lot of sense that it has something to do with happiness. Bright and dull, famous and unknown, that's basically it. I can also have answer question and patient doctor, but it doesn't have that much weight. Then trust. Trust has to do apparently with quiet and noisy, kind and cruel. These are the things that seem to matter in order to measure it. This is a European survey that we have used here. It's for trust here: innocent, guilty, bright, dull, success and failure. These are the pairs that basically characterize it. And same thing for this European survey for happiness, and there it's bright, dull, smooth, rough, virtue, wise, hot, cold. Anyway, so as I said, that's the beginning, and now we'd like to create maps and maps over time and see how the financial crisis and other disruptive events basically change these kind of things. And then it would be very useful for politics and maybe also even business. So how to measure social well-being? What matters? So we talked already about trust and happiness. We could also try to measure liberty to influence decisions and own fate, opportunity for creativity and innovation, access to knowledge and resources, level of hate and conflict, and maybe other things that are to be discussed. So we have been working a little bit also on measuring the production and spreading of knowledge. So this is how productivity in terms of number of publications and citations has changed over time. What we were interested though is what are the places that are actually coming up with new knowledge, and these are the most innovative places, and which are the places that are consuming that knowledge. And so red are the consumers, green are the producers of new knowledge. And you can see that apparently freedom seems to be good for the creation of new ideas. If you're not allowed to have a new idea that contradicts a previous way of thinking, well then apparently it's hard to publish about it, right? And to spread this idea. So freedom seems to matter. We've also been looking into the spreading of memes here, physical concepts. I found it actually quite useful to see how different fields in physics were important. So over here you can see black hole, quantum wells, quantum hole, position, Einstein, neutrino, quark, entanglement, graphene, and all these kind of things, right? Pretty clear picture that you get. We've also been engaged in mapping cultural spreading with birth death data of artists and notable people, and you can even reconstruct the discovery of America with this kind of data. So you can see people arriving at the East Coast and eventually they're exploring the country and tend to end up at the West Coast where there is beautiful weather. Now, conflict also has been looked into by my research team. Thomas Chardefaux, for example, looked into spreading of international tensions as a result of the war on Iraq. You can see that it destabilizes the entire region around it. What he has done, he's mined huge databases of newspapers and did a text analysis, 4 words that are characteristic for tension, and he showed that actually this news is to some extent predictive of future wars, more predictive actually than the classical indicators. That's what Thomas Chardefaux did at that time. We also did another study about group segregation, urban violence, with data from the Middle East, in particular Jerusalem, where we've looked into cases of attacks. We've distinguished the different religions because the attacks are often between different religious groups. So there seems to be cultural distance that matters. There are quite a few violent incidences, and we're trying to reproduce that with an agent-based model that's being calibrated and validated, and with that model then we can basically simulate different kinds of scenarios that you could come up with in order to see what improvement certain political plans could bring about. And we looked into many different scenarios and could look into any kind of scenario. Now, here's an interesting database that you may want to look into when it comes to conflict, the GDELT project and data. I'd also like to point to another study that is quite revealing, that looks at the interrelation of spatial interaction, conflict, and migration. So migration is another thing that could be an indicator for dissatisfaction. So it makes sense to look into migration of refugees or also migration of professional things that we've done. So all those things can in principle be quantified with data. And you could also do online measurements. We've been working also on platforms for this. NervousNet, for example, is a platform that uses sensors in smartphones. We wouldn't spy on you, you would decide yourself what sensors you open to make measurements and whether you would want to share the data or not. The idea was that in principle we, the citizens, we, the people, could build our own measurement system. And then map resources and who uses them, maybe also lack of resources. There was a project that was called Swarm Pals. And also map diseases. That's something that's certainly not correlating well with social well-being. So if people are ill, then basically, yeah, there's a low degree of social well-being. So all these kind of things can be measured by people with the help of citizens and smartphones. And also, we've been working on conscious consumption in order to come up with more sustainable ways of consumption. And I'm finishing with a note on this note game platform that has been created by Stefano Baglietti, one of my Italian PhDs at that time. Now he's in Boston actually. So he created a platform for online experiments, which is open source, and you can do all sorts of sophisticated experiments. So take it into account if you want to do online measurements in the future. Yeah, that's basically it. And I'd like to say we've also been thinking about possibility to even measure things like human dignity. I should say I became a little bit more skeptical over time about this because maybe there are some things that we cannot really measure well, or that we can never really measure adequately. And if this is the case, then maybe we should recognize that there is a little bit of a danger that in a data-driven society we would only pay attention to those things that are being measured with data. And everything else tends to be forgotten. I think this is a danger. And there will probably always be things that matter that haven't been well represented by data. And we have to think about ways to run societies in a way that leaves enough space for things that cannot be well quantified. And this includes love and empathy, that includes consciousness and many other things that really are important for people and also human dignity. But in any case, certainly certain dimensions of social well-being can be measured and should be measured, and that includes health, education, environment, and things that I've mentioned over here. Yeah. So it would be great if you could really bring some of this on the way and make it part of the standard repertoire of political decision making. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Questions? Please.
Yes.
When you showed the experiment about translating the Google Trends data to the, let's say, I don't remember how you call it, but the more semantic description of the sentiments. Then you transformed, you've shown how to transform that kind of data into weight for your model. I didn't catch exactly how you transform them, but I've seen that most of the terms are similar between the various sentiments and the various measures that you are following. So you may also understand which kind of sentiment is more, let's say, dependent from the other, because this seems to be not completely independent, and the trust and happiness. That's it. So the question is, do you think about finding which are the correlation between the value set that is graph, a sort of graph of the dependencies between them?
As I indicated, this is work that's not completed. As we started this, I think it looks promising, and it's waiting for somebody who would commit herself or himself to that kind of question in order to finish that kind of work. I think it's important work, but it needs somebody who loves these kind of questions and knows how to deal with data, right? So is there anyone among you who wants to do this, just let us know.
Other questions? Okay, let's thank Dirk again.